Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Kansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the summer of 1924, the little township of Claywell County lay quiet under an unrelenting heat. The dirt road shimmered in the noon sun, and winds stirred dust motes that danced like restless spirits. It was on one such sweltering afternoon that the widow Marion Whitlock arrived at the old Aldridge farmhouse, a remote property nearly forgotten, on the outskirts of Claywell. Neighbors recalled seeing her carriage glinting in the late light, creeping over the rutted path, the horses reluctant, as though sensing something off. The house stood ramshackle, broken shutters, sagging eaves, and wild vines crawling across the porch. She claimed she was the sole surviving heir to the late Jonathan Aldridge, a man of obscure reputation, and needed to inspect the dwelling and personal effects before final settlement. The locals were uneasy. From county deeds, the Aldridge name wove through Claywell's early settlement. Jonathan's grandfather, a veteran of the Civil War, had claimed a homestead there in the 1870s. Over the generations, rumors trailed the family, whispered tales of disappearances, of livestock found mutilated, or of strange lights in windows. The last Aldridge child supposedly died in 1908 in ambiguous circumstances. No formal record survives. Town gossips noted Marion Whitlock was a distant cousin, reclusive, shrouded in mourning, and arriving almost unannounced. Her face was pale but steady, features tight, eyes sharp, hair drawn back tightly. She looked about 45. Neither youthful nor feeble. The day she arrived, one neighbor, Mrs. Eliza Kramer, whispered to her husband, "She carries herself odd, more sorrow than any soul ought to bear." Another, Mr. Tobias Green, commented later, "I've never jawed with her, but her eyes, they fix you." The first anomalies surfaced within days. The hired hand at the Aldridge property, a young man named Henry Dutton, reported hearing soft footsteps upstairs in the dead of night, though no one should have been present. He swore he glimpsed a figure at the top of the stairwell, vanishing into the darkness. On one dawn, Dutton discovered the diary collection of Jonathan Aldridge, volumes stored in a locked trunk, strewn across the floor, pages torn or smeared. Some pages were missing entirely. At the Corning Ledger in Claywell, Dutton lodged a formal statement. "I roused to scratching, whispers I could not place, then pages fell as though thrown." Meanwhile, town gossip mingled with small newspaper notices, a brief mention in the Claywell Gazette of a mysterious arrival, and a local constable's vague warning that trespassing would be prosecuted. Several days later, Marion requested the services of the county clerk, Thomas Beale, to inventory certain personal effects. In correspondences archived later, Beale noted her calm insistence. "Miss Whitlock desires full access and will leave no stone unturned." He also wrote that she refused the presence of an assistant, prefers privacy. In his journal, Beale admitted he sensed unease in the walls. While reviewing the inventory in a downstairs chamber, he claimed to sense a shift in air, a faint draft, though windows were shut. He left that evening with a stiff neck and an uneasy tremor. By late August of 1924, Claywell's evenings grew strangely quiet. Locals began keeping their lamps burning longer, and children were told not to wander near the Aldridge property after dusk. Henry Dutton quit his position abruptly, claiming he'd seen someone standing behind the widow in the parlor mirror. When pressed, he admitted he couldn't tell if it was a man or a reflection distorted by the lamplight. His statement, recorded in the county logbook, was dismissed by Constable Avery Holt as nervousness brought on by whiskey or heat. Yet, within the week, Dutton was gone. His wagon found near the riverbank. No sign of him anywhere. Holt wrote tersely in his final report, "No indication of foul play. Man likely absconded." The entry was dated September 2, 1924. The Court of Industrial Relations in Topeka was still making headlines then, and local news had little patience for small-town mysteries. Only the Claywell Gazette ran a single column under "Farmhand Missing, No Clues." Marion Whitlock herself made no statement. Neighbors said they saw her on the porch that evening, still as a statue, the diary in her lap, eyes fixed on the horizon. One witness, Reverend Samuel Dorr, later testified that she whispered something about truth being buried twice. He wasn't sure what she meant. The farmhouse itself drew whispers. Visitors to the property, deliverymen, census takers, spoke of a sound, like faint humming from the cellar, though no machinery existed there. One described it as a woman's hum without a mouth. When Clerk Beale returned for the second inventory in early September, he noted in his field book that several ledgers were gone, and one chest, previously locked, stood ajar. Inside were papers written in 2 different hands, Jonathan Aldridge's angular script and a softer, looping hand assumed to be Marion's. Many pages were blotted by moisture, others by what looked like soot. The entries mentioned dates between 1905 and 1910, years when Jonathan supposedly lived alone. One passage referred to a burden in the foundation. Beale filed the note, but the reference was ignored until decades later. It was around this period that the widow ceased attending Sunday service, claiming frailty. The townsfolk, ever polite in daylight, whispered cruelly at dusk. Some said she had lost her husband under unnatural causes. Others muttered that she had never been a widow at all, that no Whitlock burial record existed in Kansas. By October, the house windows had been shuttered from inside. No smoke rose from the chimney, though lantern lights sometimes flickered after midnight. 2 boys, Milton and Arlo Keene, dared each other to approach the porch one evening. Both swore they saw a shadow moving between rooms, though the front door was padlocked from the outside. Reverend Dorr kept brief notes for his sermon that Sunday. The living often linger too long with their dead. By early November 1924, frost settled over Claywell County. The last crops were taken in, and the fields around the Aldridge property turned to brittle stalks and silence. Marion Whitlock was rarely seen beyond the fence line. A milk delivery driver named Lester Gray reported hearing her voice through the door when he came to collect payment. She spoke kindly, he said, but her words sounded rehearsed, like she was answering someone standing beside her. He left the bottles and found the envelope of coins always placed precisely on the same step, folded neatly in paper, bearing the faint scent of kerosene. Inside the farmhouse, Marion kept her windows covered. A faint rhythmic tapping was often heard at night, though those who passed claimed it was just loose wood in the walls. One letter later uncovered in the county archives was written by her to Thomas Beale, though never sent. It read, "The diary is not mine, Mr. Beale. It writes itself when the lamps dim. The ink does not dry." The handwriting was steady, almost formal. No one could tell whether she believed her words or was attempting to frighten him. In December, Beale persuaded Constable Holt to visit the property again. The official report, now brittle in the Claywell Records Office, mentioned an unpleasant odor near the foundation and recently disturbed soil behind the house. Holt made a note to return with assistance, but no such follow-up exists. What is recorded instead is that Holt resigned the following spring and moved east, leaving no forwarding address. The Claywell Gazette ran a half-column about a hermit widow maintaining residence at the Aldridge homestead, briefly referencing the old court of industrial relations in Topeka as part of a larger article about changing times in Kansas. The mention of the court, oddly enough, aligned the story of a lone woman in the fields with the idea of law and structure, something far removed from what the townsfolk felt as they passed that farmhouse. During that same winter, Reverend Dorr wrote that parishioners had begun seeing lights low to the ground, moving in rhythm, as if lanterns swung by invisible hands. He dismissed these tales as the product of fog and drink, but later added that Mrs. Whitlock's prayers have turned private and prolonged, lasting until dawn. When the church bell cracked in the freeze that February, she donated a sum for its repair. The coins she left were spotless, though no one recalled seeing her enter town. The shoemaker's apprentice swore she appeared in his doorway one afternoon asking for a brush, then vanished before he could fetch one. Like she'd walked out of the air, he told the sheriff years later. By the time spring came, the property stood quieter still. No letters, no visitors, and the diary, if one still existed, was locked away somewhere inside. Beale's successor, Clerk Raymond Ellis, would later describe the place as a hollow on the edge of memory, where paper outlasts people. Spring of 1925 arrived pale and hesitant. The rains washed over Claywell's dirt lanes, cutting rivulets through the hard soil, but around the Aldridge farmhouse, water refused to settle. It ran off in strange channels, revealing stones beneath the yard that no one recalled being there before. A new field hand hired from neighboring Lyon County, a man named Earl Madsen, took brief work repairing the fences. He later told a visiting deputy that the ground felt hollow near the north wall. "When I struck it with my spade," he said, "it sounded like a drum." The statement was filed but never acted upon. The farmhouse itself stood unchanged, shutters closed, chimney unused, the faint smell of oil drifting on still mornings. Marian Whitlock, now rarely glimpsed, had grown thinner, her gait slower. One grocer recalled her gloved hand trembling as she signed the receipt. Her voice cracked like it had forgotten how to sound human, he said. In June, the county received an anonymous parcel. Inside was a small leather-bound book labeled only Ledger A. The handwriting matched Jonathan Aldridge's from decades earlier, but the later entries, written in a finer hand, belonged unmistakably to Marian. The pages described not finances, but a sort of catalogue of silences, listing nights and peculiar sounds beneath the floorboards. One passage noted, "Each noise repeats in threes, the last always closer than the first." Beale's successor, Ellis, logged the document, but before it could be examined, it disappeared from the records vault. A faint, oily stain remained on the shelf where it had been placed. By midsummer, the widow had shuttered herself completely. Neighbors reported the windows were nailed from the inside. No one saw smoke, yet on certain nights a reddish flicker glowed behind the drapes. Rumors turned wild. Some said she was hiding a fugitive. Others believed she had gone mad and painted the walls with scripture. A letter dated July 14, 1925, written by Reverend Dorr to his brother in Wichita, survives. Claywell grows uneasy. Mrs. Whitlock's dwelling hums at night, and the dogs won't cross the road. She has taken to walking the property line with a lantern, whispering as though naming the dead. The Claywell Gazette, weary of the gossip, published a dismissive editorial calling such tales the superstition of idle minds. But that same issue carried a small notice about the collapse of a cellar wall at a nearby farm. Inside, workers found animal bones arranged in deliberate patterns. The article did not link it to the Aldridge place, yet many in town quietly did. As the harvest season approached, the sound of hammering was heard from within the farmhouse, though no visitors were ever seen entering or leaving. One boy gathering firewood near the creek swore he saw a woman through an upstairs window holding a book to her chest and mouthing words with her eyes closed. He described her expression as, "Not sad, just waiting." Autumn 1925 brought with it the first chill winds that swept through Claywell's brittle cornfields. The township was quieter now, its population thinned by migration and bad harvests, leaving the roads empty for miles. Yet, even in the stillness, talk of the widow persisted. Thomas Beale, who had long since retired but still lived nearby, wrote to Ellis at the courthouse that certain papers were never meant to surface. He referred again to Ledger A, the vanished volume, claiming its contents concerned human remains mistaken for soil. His handwriting was shaky but clear. The letter, filed in the county archive, remains unsigned at its end, the pen stroke trailing off. Marian Whitlock was seen only once that season, by two schoolchildren walking home from church. They claim she stood in the yard among overturned furniture, a small fire burning in a metal basin. She was feeding pages to it, one said, but the pages wouldn't catch. They turned black and then white again. The following month, a surveyor named Walter Keene visited the property to reassess boundaries after a minor land dispute. He later recounted the visit in an affidavit. The air inside the house was stale, heavy with mildew and lamp oil. He found Marian in the parlor, dressed all in black, her hands resting on an open book. She greeted him politely but spoke in riddles. "Every name written twice," she told him. "Once for memory, once for mercy." He completed his work quickly, unnerved by her composure. As he prepared to leave, she asked if he had ever heard of the Court of Industrial Relations in Topeka. When he said yes, she smiled faintly and replied, "Even justice fades when no one's left to claim it." Keene left before dusk and reported that the windows reflected movement when there was none inside. His written account, preserved in the courthouse ledger, ends with the line, "The room breathed," or so it seemed. Later that year, after an early snow, tracks were found circling the house, barefoot prints, small and irregular, leading nowhere. Constable Holt's replacement, Officer Marin, visited the property but found it deserted. A kettle still warm sat atop the stove, though the fire beneath had died. The diary volumes Jonathan Aldridge had once kept were gone. Only a single torn page was found, wedged behind a floorboard. Below, all words repeat themselves. The farmhouse was officially listed as uninhabited that winter. Tax notices went unanswered. By early 1926, it was struck from the county rolls as abandoned pending estate verification. Yet according to one report in the Claywell Gazette, faint light continued to appear in the upper windows, even after snow covered the steps and the keyholes froze. Reverend Doerr's last written remark on the matter reads simply, "If she is gone, then who tends the lamp?" The spring thaw of 1926 revealed more than just new shoots in the fields. Along the eastern boundary of the Aldridge property, several sinkholes opened after heavy rain, one of which exposed a section of stonework long buried under layers of mud and roots. Farmers inspecting the damage found fragments of wooden beams, iron hinges, and what appeared to be portions of a cellar wall extending farther than the main foundation. Deputy Marin, already uneasy from prior visits, returned with 2 laborers to investigate. His official notes describe a chamber of crude stonework, likely older than the house itself. He also recorded the presence of charred remnants of books or journals, unidentifiable, and a distinct odor of oil and decay. No further excavation was attempted. The hole was filled and marked with a simple wooden cross to prevent accidents. But according to a local rumor, the workers refused payment, one claiming his hands stung as if bitten after touching the soil. A week later, the widow's personal effects were auctioned by order of the county. Most items were ordinary, china sets, faded photographs, a few family letters, but one trunk, sealed with wax, was withheld from sale. Clerk Ellis wrote that it contained papers of private nature. The trunk was transferred to the county archives, yet no record of its inventory survives. What does remain is a penciled note in Ellis's ledger: "Do not unseal unless in presence of Reverend Doerr." Doerr, however, fell ill that same month and died shortly thereafter. With no further authority, the trunk was never opened. Meanwhile, the townsfolk had begun referring to the farmhouse as the Widow's Hollow. Travelers who ventured near claimed to see faint glimmers under the eaves, like candlelight moving from room to room. One itinerant preacher, Reverend Gage, stayed overnight in the area and later told the Claywell Gazette, "There in the silence there is not empty. It listens." The paper printed his statement under the heading "Superstition in the Plains," but letters to the editor poured in for weeks. A few older residents recalled that the Aldridge family, even before Marion's arrival, had been known to keep journals no one could read. One man swore his grandfather had seen Jonathan himself carrying small boxes to the root cellar before his disappearance in 1910. By midsummer, the farmhouse roof began to sag. The county debated demolition, but delayed due to lack of funds. That delay proved fateful. A fire broke out on the night of August 2, 1926. Witnesses from the next ridge described the blaze as bright but soundless, as though muffled by the air itself. By dawn, only the chimney and a section of the parlor wall remained. No body was recovered. In the ash, Deputy Marin found the melted clasp of a diary and several unburned pages fused together. One phrase was still legible: "The ink dries when the voices stop." In the aftermath of the 1926 fire, Claywell County found itself torn between relief and unease. The widow's farmhouse was gone, but its absence seemed to deepen the strangeness rather than end it. For weeks after the blaze, locals reported a faint odor of oil drifting through the valley whenever the wind shifted east. Deputy Merrin filed his final report, stating there was no evidence of arson, no body recovered, and no verifiable cause of ignition. Yet his private notebook, later found among his belongings after his retirement, told another story. He wrote that the parlor wall which survived the fire bore handprints burned into the plaster, small and overlapping, as though pressed there by more than one person. Some faced upward, he wrote, like they were reaching out from below. By late autumn that year, children from neighboring farms began bringing home fragments from the ruins: buttons, bits of glass, and small scraps of charred fabric. Parents forbade further scavenging after one boy, Arlo Keene, developed severe burns on his hands, though he had only touched what he described as a piece of dark paper. Reverend Gage performed a brief blessing on the site, sprinkling water and reciting psalms, but later told the Gazette editor that the silence after the prayer felt heavier than before it. The remains of the chimney were fenced off and left to crumble. Meanwhile, the county tried to finalize the estate. Clerks discovered that no verifiable birth or marriage record for Marion Whitlock existed in Kansas or any neighboring state. Letters sent to Missouri and Oklahoma yielded nothing. Her supposed husband's death certificate, filed under Whitlock, listed no cause and was signed by a doctor who had died in 1915. The mystery deepened when, during a routine review, Ellis found a note tucked inside one of Beale's old folders. If she was not the widow, then whose knows? Me did she take? By the close of 1927, the farmhouse site was considered cursed ground. Travelers avoided the road that cut near it, claiming their horses balked without reason. A railway survey crew passing through reported compass interference near the ruins, needles quivering or reversing direction. No explanation was found, though a brief mention appeared in a Wichita engineering journal as a curiosity. Even decades later, older residents remembered those years as the season when the land went quiet. One farmer told his grandson that the earth there never took seed right again. The story might have ended with the fire, but in 1928, an archivist cataloging the courthouse basement found the missing Ledger A. The book was intact, its cover warped by heat, but the pages preserved. No one claimed responsibility for returning it. Inside, the final entry, dated February 1926, read, "Light beneath the floor again, slower now. The pages hum before they write." Ellis sealed the book in an envelope marked "Evidence, do not display." He resigned 2 weeks later without explanation. The rediscovery of Ledger A in 1928 reignited quiet speculation among the few who still remembered the widow's case. Officially, the book remained sealed, but fragments of its contents leaked through courthouse gossip. A young assistant named Clara Morn was said to have opened it briefly during inventory. Her written statement, found later in the archives, describes writing that shifts between two inks, and margins filled with faint impressions, as if someone had pressed a second sheet against the page while the ink was still wet. She claimed that some entries appeared days after the last known date, as though continuing beyond the author's death. Her supervisor dismissed this as melodrama, but within the month, Morn resigned, leaving behind her uniform badge and a note that read, "They breathe when the book is open." During this same year, the Kansas Historical Society in Topeka requested temporary custody of the Ulrich materials, citing their connection to rural development records and the now-defunct Court of Industrial Relations. The files were transferred, but correspondence shows they were never formally logged. One letter from the Society's curator, Dr. Wilmer James, to Clerk Ellis survives. "Your shipment arrived with strong odor of oil. Please advise if preservation treatment was applied." Ellis, by then in fragile health, never replied. The following winter, Dr. James vanished while traveling to Osage City. His automobile was found abandoned beside the road, engine cold, personal effects undisturbed. The case was reported but unresolved. By 1930, Claywell's population had dwindled further, and the site of the Aldridge farmhouse was absorbed into private farmland. The new owner, Edward Klein, tried to plow the area but complained that his machinery jammed every time he crossed the eastern boundary. He later told neighbors that he struck a layer of black sea, tone that rang when hit. He dug no further. His fields yielded poorly, though nearby farms thrived. Klein's daughter, writing in her diary in 1942, described finding a metal clasp in the soil shaped like an eye. The artifact was later lost in a house fire. The legend of the widow became local folklore, a story whispered to frighten children. Yet older residents swore it had truth behind it. Some even remembered hearing the name Marion Whitlock spoken during sermons long after her disappearance, as if she'd become part of the town's cautionary history. Reverend Gage, in his later letters, referred to her case as a sorrow the Lord left unfinished. He died in 1933, and his personal Bible, preserved at the parish, contains a folded scrap of paper inscribed with a single sentence: "Do not pray for her. She already listens." By 1934, the widow's story had nearly faded from official memory, buried under new hardships, the Dust Bowl storms, and the collapse of small-town banks. Yet in Claywell, her name still drifted through the tavern corners, and among those who remembered her carriage wheels crunching over the dry road that first summer. A Works Progress Administration survey brought a few outsiders into the county that year, tasked with mapping derelict farms. Among them was a draftsman named Harold Densmore. His sketches, preserved in the state archives, include a peculiar annotation beside one field labeled Old Aldridge Lot. He drew the outline of a structure no longer standing, then added a faint rectangular mark beside it, captioned simply, "Sunken Cellar, Echo when Stepped Upon." Densmore's supervisor dismissed it as a drafting error, but Densmore's later diary, recovered from his estate, states otherwise. "When I set my foot there, it sounded hollow, as if the earth remembered." That same year, an aging Thomas Beale, nearly 70 by then, sent one final letter to the Claywell Gazette, written in a trembling hand. He claimed the widow's journal had not perished in the fire. According to him, copies existed written before the blaze, one kept beneath the floor. The editor never printed the letter, considering Beale senile, but he kept it folded in his desk. It remained there until his death in 1951. Locals recounted that Beale sometimes wandered near the old property at dusk, muttering the same phrase, every name twice. When asked what he meant, he refused to explain. Children who followed him from a distance claimed he would kneel at the boundary fence and whisper toward the soil before walking away. By 1937, Claywell's parish acquired new leadership under Reverend Paul Dorr, the nephew of Samuel Dorr. Sorting through his uncle's belongings, he found a sealed envelope marked F, or whoever tends the hollow. Inside was a brittle photograph dated 1924. It depicted a woman standing beside the Aldridge porch, her hand on the railing, face half turned to the camera. The detail was faint, but her eyes seemed to catch the light unnaturally, too bright, too sharp. Behind her, in the shadow of the doorway, a faint second outline appeared. Some dismissed it as a photographic fault. Others weren't so sure. Reverend Dorr placed the image in the church archive, where it remains today under restricted access. In 1940, the property was officially absorbed into the state's rural conservation zone. Bulldozers leveled most of the remaining foundation, but the operators stopped short when one machine sank slightly, its front wheel caving through soft soil. Beneath it was a small void containing remnants of timber and an iron lock plate identical to the one on Marion's trunk. The foreman, unsure what to do, filled the hole and ordered the crew not to speak of it. The state report simply lists the incident as minor ground instability. By 1942, Claywell County had become a place spoken of mostly in the past tense. The last remaining residents still tended their small farms, though most of the younger generation had left for the war or for factory work in Kansas City. The old Aldridge property, reduced to a shallow depression and a few chimney stones, was now part of an overgrown pasture. Yet that spring, something stirred the memory of the widow again. A storm had rolled through overnight, violent and short, tearing up roots and unearthing pieces of the old stone foundation. The following morning, the new landowner, Edward Klein's widow, reported to the sheriff that her dog refused to go near the exposed area, growling until its throat went hoarse. When she later inspected the damage, she found several rusted hinges and a fragment of charred wood etched with what looked like a date, 1925. The mark was faint, but beneath it were smaller letters, almost invisible. Marion. The sheriff filed the finding under miscellaneous debris, though it quietly reached the attention of Reverend Paul Dorr, who by then had taken an interest in local folklore. In his journal, he wrote that the air near the hollow carries a charge, as if lightning never quite left. He attempted to read the old Ledger A again, which had since been transferred from Topeka back to county storage after the archives were damaged in a flood. The book's pages had fused with moisture, but one corner bore a note in a woman's hand. "I cannot bury the sound." Dorr shared this discovery privately with a colleague at the seminary who advised him to leave the dead in peace. Still, Dorr continued to study the case, gathering fragments of newspaper clippings and interviews with aging residents. Among those he spoke to was Lester Gray, the milk driver who had delivered to Marion 20 years earlier. Gray, now an old man, confessed that he had once entered the house without permission when she failed to answer the door. "The room was empty," he said, "but I heard her talking upstairs. Only there wasn't any voice to answer." He described hearing something moving above him, slow and deliberate, and a faint creak like a chair shifting. When he looked up, dust drifted down in spirals, and he ran out before seeing more. Dorr transcribed the account but never published it, noting that Gray's hands trembled uncontrollably while recounting it. That same year, as Dorr worked on a lecture about rural hauntings, he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, blurred, showing what looked like a book resting on a dirt floor, its cover open though no one held it. The faint outline of handwriting was visible, and across the bottom margin someone had written, "She waits where ink dries." Dorr placed the photograph with his uncle's earlier collection and locked them both away. He never spoke publicly of the widow again. Still, even then, townsfolk swore that during the heaviest rains, when the wind came from the east, the valley near the old Ulrich place hummed low, like a bow drawn across the edge of a glass. The war years passed, and by 1946 Claywell barely appeared on maps. Its schoolhouse had closed, the church roof had collapsed, and the rail line that once brought freight now lay rusted beneath tall weeds. Yet the hollow, where the Ulrich farmhouse once stood, remained curiously untouched, as if the land itself refused to heal. Reverend Paul Dorr, now aging and frail, returned to the site one last time accompanied by a young theology student named Martin Kelser. The student's later recollection, written decades afterward, described a place where the silence was layered, like different tones of quiet, stacked on each other. Dorr knelt near the old chimney base and murmured a prayer. But when Kelser looked down, he saw Dorr's breath condense, though the air was warm. "He was whispering a name," Kelser said, "but it wasn't Marion. It sounded older." A week later, Dorr mailed a sealed envelope to the county courthouse labeled, "For Record, The Widow's Hollow." Inside were pages of notes, including one cryptic line, "The ink bleeds up through the soil." These notes vanished sometime before the 1950 inventory. Only the cover page remains, its edges faintly blackened as if singed by heat. The courthouse janitor, years later, claimed to have smelled oil whenever he opened the archive drawers on humid days. Meanwhile, small traces of the story crept beyond Kansas. An article in a Topeka periodical titled Forgotten Frontiers mentioned a reclusive woman who kept a diary that would not burn, connecting her case to the cultural shifts following the Court of Industrial Relations. It argued that such stories reflected the unease of an era when tradition collided with modern law, though the author confessed that, in Claywell, myth and record seemed to occupy the same breath. In 1948, a traveling photographer named Nora Willoughby passed through the region documenting abandoned rural properties. One of her surviving plates shows the hollow from a distance, nothing but grass and collapsed stone. But in the lower corner of the frame, barely visible, is a faint, standing figure near the old fence line. Willoughby annotated the print simply, self-timer error. Yet when enlarged years later, the figure's proportions were inconsistent, shoulders too narrow, arms held rigidly against the body as though posed. The negative, stored at the Wichita Historical Museum, has since developed streaks of silvering that obscure the background entirely. By the decade's end, few in Claywell even remembered the name Whitlock. The last mention appears in a 1949 land dispute report, area previously identified as Widow's Hollow, unsuitable for cultivation due to unstable ground. The notation seems mundane, but beneath it, someone penciled a single faint word: listening. No initials, no date, just that word, left as if whoever wrote it feared being overheard. The 1950s brought highways and electric lines to much of rural Kansas, but Claywell was bypassed entirely, left like a knot in the old road system, quiet, dusty, and shrinking. Travelers who strayed from the new routes sometimes found themselves along the stretch where the Aldridge farmhouse once stood. By then, even the hollow had softened, grass overtaking the foundation stones. Yet, in August of 1952, a highway inspector named Carl Benton stopped to rest there during a surveying trip and later filed an incident report that would quietly circulate among the district offices. Benton wrote that while eating his lunch, he noticed something unusual: the faint outline of rectangles in the soil, dark as ink, marking where floorboards might once have lain. As the wind passed over them, he said, the lines seemed to shimmer. When he brushed his hand over one, the ground beneath it gave a pulse. Not a vibration, but a slow, breathing movement. His colleague dismissed it as fatigue, but Benton's report was placed in the archive under unverified anomalies. Around the same time in Topeka, a historian named Dr. Ada Merrick revisited the surviving notes from the Court of Industrial Relations. While reviewing rural case files, she found Marion Whitlock's name written faintly in the margin of an unrelated 1921 dispute, years before the widow ever appeared in Claywell. The handwriting was in pencil, likely added by a clerk, but the placement was odd, beside a sentence discussing the fairness of wages and silence of record. Merrick sent a query to Clay County's office for clarification and received only a one-line reply. No such record ever existed here. Weeks later, she noted in her diary that her office began smelling of kerosene, despite there being no source. It lingers only when I read her name, she wrote. That fall, Reverend Paul Dorr passed away quietly in his sleep. Among his few possessions was a box of papers labeled Claywell, Personal Reflections. Inside were sketches of the old Aldridge property drawn from memory, each one darker than the last. On the final page he had written, "Every prayer becomes an echo if no one listens." His successor found the box too damaged to keep and ordered it burned. The flames burned low, producing thick smoke with an odor witnesses described as sweet and oily, like ink and sap. By the mid-1950s, the last physical sign of the Aldridge homestead vanished. Heavy rains eroded the ridge entirely, washing debris into the creek below. Yet a few miles north, near the old boundary road, motorists began reporting a faint light on foggy nights, always stationary, about shoulder height, glimmering for several seconds before fading. Locals called it the widow's lamp. The highway department investigated twice but found nothing. One report noted that the phenomenon occurred most often between July and September, dates aligning exactly with the widow's arrival and disappearance 3 decades earlier. By 1956, Claywell had become a ghost town in all but name. The church stood roofless, its bell long stolen for scrap, and the post office operated only 3 days a week. The last family remaining near the hollow were the Parkers, who grazed cattle across the overgrown fields. In a letter to a cousin, Ruth Parker mentioned that their animals avoided a patch near the old foundation stones. "They circle it, lowing," she wrote. "Even when hungry, they won't cross that ground." Her husband, Milton Parker, later testified to the county board that one morning He found a shallow depression in that same area, shaped like a footprint, but larger, and that the soil around it was warm, though the air was cold. The board recorded his statement, but took no action. That winter, a research assistant from the University of Kansas, Edwin Laird, came through Claywell collecting local folklore for a thesis on rural hauntings. He interviewed several aging residents who still remembered the widow. One, an elderly Mrs. Eliza Kramer, was by then nearly blind, but spoke with surprising clarity. "She wasn't wicked," she said, "just listening to something none of us could hear." Laird included the quote in his notes, adding that during the interview, the glass in his pocket watch fogged over and stopped ticking for nearly an hour. When he left Claywell, he took a handful of soil from the hollow for laboratory testing. The results, though inconclusive, recorded faint traces of carbonized cellulose, consistent with burned paper. In 1958, a local schoolteacher found a sealed envelope in a desk drawer at the defunct Claywell schoolhouse, addressed to "Future Readers, Should the Ground Rise." Inside were 2 pages, written in neat, old-fashioned script. "There are words that write themselves again each night. They do not fade when forgotten. The cellar still breathes." No one ever determined the author, though the handwriting matched samples of Marion Whitlock's recorded by Clerk Beale decades earlier. The envelope is preserved today at the Kansas Historical Society, labeled simply Anonymous Testament, 1920s-30s. That same summer, torrential rains caused the creek below the old property to flood, carrying silt and fragments of stone downstream. Among the debris, a small metal clasp was recovered, its design identical to the binding hardware used on journals of the 1910s. It was catalogued but later went missing during transfer to Topeka. The archivist's note at the time reads, "Possible connection to the widow's estate, though provenance uncertain." In the years that followed, Claywell was officially disincorporated. The last census listed the population as 12. The site of the Aldridge farmhouse became part of the highway buffer zone, fenced off and marked as unfit for development. Still, passing drivers occasionally reported seeing faint smoke rising from the field on cold mornings, though no fire was ever found. One trucker swore he saw a woman standing amid the mist, holding what looked like a book pressed to her chest, her dress stirring though the air was still. He did not stop. By 1961, Claywell no longer appeared on standard maps, existing only as a name buried in county registries. The highway curved wide around what had once been the township, and travelers who took the old service road passed only windbreaks and foundations, half swallowed by prairie grass. Yet a few people still came deliberately: historians, drifters, and the curious. Among them was a journalist from Wichita, Martha Dean, who arrived that autumn following a local rumor about the book that writes on its own. Her article, published later under the title "The Widow's Hollow, A Case of Rural Memory," treated the story as folklore, but admitted to elements of record too consistent to dismiss. She described visiting the site at dusk, noting a stillness so dense it feels like a wall of air, and finding small shards of blackened porcelain near where the parlor had once stood. In her notes, she added privately, "The earth here smells faintly of kerosene." Dean interviewed Reverend Dorr's successor, who confirmed that several items from the old parish archives had gone missing around 1950, including the photograph of Marion on the porch. "We locked it in a tin box," he said. "When I opened it next, there was nothing but soot." Dean's subsequent letter to the Kansas Historical Society requesting confirmation of Ledger A's whereabouts went unanswered. A year later, she received a package without return address. Inside was a single torn page, browned with age. The handwriting matched that found in the courthouse samples. It read, "If they close the soil, I will open the ink." She kept the page sealed in a glass frame until her death in 1974. The page has since disappeared from her estate. Around the same period, geological survey teams began testing soil across central Kansas. Their instruments occasionally malfunctioned near Claywell, recording faint electromagnetic fluctuations, consistent with the region's terrain. One technician joked that the ground must still be whispering down there. His remark was later included in a departmental memo as a curiosity. By 1965, even the rumor of the widow had become a kind of cautionary story passed among the few remaining farmers along the county line. They spoke of her without malice, as if she had become part of the landscape itself, a name attached to the earth like a warning carved into old wood. A school geography textbook published that year listed Claywell as abandoned following fire and environmental decay, but tucked into its appendix was an uncredited photo of a woman from the 1920s standing before a farmhouse with dark windows. Beneath the image, the caption read simply, "Widow in Kansas, circa 1924. The source was unknown." That same year, an amateur historian visiting the area at twilight described hearing faint scratching from the soil when the wind died. "It sounded like a pen," he said, "drawing lines I couldn't see." He returned the next day with a notebook to record the phenomenon, but never completed his entry. The last sentence ends mid-word, the ink trailing into a thin, dark smear. By the early 1970s, the name Marion Whitlock was barely remembered, though her legend persisted in fragments. Half-remembered whispers passed between archivists and rural historians. In 1971, a graduate student named Thomas Rowe from Emporia State University began researching vanished homesteads of northern Kansas for his thesis. When he reached Claywell, locals directed him to the field once known as the Widow's Hollow. Rowe's field journal, later found among his belongings, described the place as utterly still, as though sound itself were exhausted. He spent 2 days photographing the area and camping nearby. On his second night, he recorded in his notes, "There is a faint odor of lamp oil. Heard something like paper turning in the grass, though there is no wind." The following morning, his camera tripod was found toppled, and a single photograph remained inside, an overexposed image showing faint horizontal lines across the ground resembling text. Rowe's advisor dismissed it as film degradation. That same summer, a Kansas Historical Society archivist rediscovered the inventory tag for Ledger A, long presumed lost in the Topeka flood of 1936. The record stated the item had been temporarily loaned to Reverend Paul Dorr, Claywell Parish, 1947, and never returned. The archivist noted in the margin, "Storage requested again, origin unknown." Within months, she too resigned, citing persistent unease while handling the files. Her personal diary, later reviewed by colleagues, contained a final entry dated October 3, 1972. "The ink bleeds up again." Meanwhile, rumors of lights near the old Claywell site reappeared. Truckers on the new U.S. Route 75 claimed to see a glow hovering low to the ground, about the height of a lantern, vanishing as they approached. Some reported the smell of oil or damp paper. Local authorities dismissed it as swamp gas or headlight reflection. Yet one driver, Frank Melrose, filed a statement asserting he saw a woman in dark clothing holding a book close to her chest. He described her face as expressionless but aware. His report was never followed up. By 1975, the land surrounding the hollow was slated for a new grain terminal, but construction halted after repeated subsidence of soil. Heavy machinery sank unexpectedly, leaving shallow craters that filled with dark water overnight. The project was abandoned after engineers declared the ground structurally unreliable. One worker, interviewed years later, said, "The dirt wasn't soft, it was tired." That winter, a journalist revisiting Martha Dean's earlier work found her sealed frame missing from the local museum display. Only a faint rectangular imprint remained on the wall, and the placard reading, "The Widow's Journal, Unverified," hung crooked. The curator insisted the piece had never existed. Still, visitors claimed that under certain light, the faint outline of a page could be seen, hovering like a watermark, carrying a single word in blurred ink. "Remember." By 1978, the state's plans to repurpose the Claywell site had stalled completely. Reports of unstable ground and unexplained subsidence were too frequent to ignore. A geotechnical survey ordered that spring revealed a curious anomaly. Beneath the topsoil lay a thin layer of charred sediment interspersed with fragments of paper fiber and what appeared to be rusted metal clasps. The chief analyst, Dr. Aaron Weir, wrote that the material resembles the residue of bound documents burned under compression. His report was filed, then quietly sealed at the county level. Unofficially, one of his assistants later told a colleague that when they disturbed the lowest layer, a faint vapor rose that smelled of ink and oil mixed together. No health hazard was identified, yet none of the team volunteered to return. That same year, a folklorist named Elaine Caro published a small volume titled Echoes of the Plains, Hauntings and Histories of the Midwest. One chapter, The Widow's Hollow, compiled decades of scattered testimony, drawing from courthouse fragments, newspaper clippings, and the surviving correspondence of Reverend Dorr. Caro's tone was academic but cautious. She concluded that, whether fact or invention, the record of Marion Whitlock endures through its absence. She noted that both the Claywell Gazette archives and the county's 1920s census rolls showed unusual gaps around the years 1924 to 1926, files missing entire sections without explanation. The book sold modestly, but drew letters from readers claiming to have encountered similar journals that rewrite themselves across Kansas and Oklahoma. Caro dismissed these as coincidences, though she privately annotated her own copy. Several names repeat. 1. M. Whitlock. In 1979, a team from the Kansas State Historical Preservation Office visited the site to photograph remaining structures. Their official album, now digitized, shows only empty prairie and a single bent fence post. Yet according to one intern, 2 frames taken at dusk were later removed from the negatives, replaced by blanks labeled exposure error. The intern, now elderly, recalled the missing photographs clearly. There was light inside the earth, like the ground itself glowed for a moment and then went dark again. By the dawn of the 1980s, Claywell had vanished from public consciousness once more. Maps showed nothing but open terrain. Still, travelers occasionally stopped at the old service road to rest, drawn by the view of the endless plain. Some described hearing a faint rhythmic tapping from below the soil, 3 slow beats, followed by silence. Those who lingered claimed the sound grew softer when they spoke aloud, as if listening. Local rumor held that on rare, calm nights, a woman's silhouette could be seen by the fence line, facing east, hands clasped around something small, unmoving. One farmer said he approached once, calling out a greeting, but the figure only tilted her head as though straining to hear. When he reached the spot, there was nothing but the smell of scorched paper and the faint outline of shoeprints leading nowhere. By the mid-1980s, what had once been Claywell was referred to simply as the Flats. Local maps no longer marked the name, and newcomers driving through assumed it was just another stretch of empty Kansas field. But those who lived nearby, the few who remembered old families and stories, still spoke softly of the widow. In 1983, a journalist named Peter Lang revisited the legend for a regional magazine, writing an article titled The Woman Who Wouldn't Burn. He interviewed descendants of early residents, including a frail man named Arlo Keene, the same boy who decades earlier had claimed to see a shadow moving in the farmhouse window. Now nearly 70, Keene recalled it clearly. She was looking out at us, he said. Not to scare, not to warn, just waiting. Lang's piece never made it to print. His editor pulled it after Lang reported mechanical issues with his typewriter, letters repeating themselves on the page even when he struck each key once. He abandoned the draft, but a carbon copy of the unfinished manuscript later surfaced in his estate sale, with several lines overwritten in darker ink, every name twice. Meanwhile, soil engineers assessing new telephone line routes noted that the area around the hollow still exhibited unusual magnetic drift, instruments wavering by several degrees when aligned to north. Their report included a side note describing the presence of faint hydrocarbon residue consistent with kerosene, though no storage tanks or buried containers were found. One technician, interviewed much later, said the odor seemed strongest near a patch of ground where no grass would grow. When I stood there, he said, It felt like someone else was standing just behind me. In 1985, a student from Kansas State University named Linda Cho began a project on unresolved cases in rural mythology. She visited the Topeka archives to locate Ledger A, only to find its catalog card reclassified as document withdrawn for preservation. When she asked to view the preservation logs, she was told they were missing. In her thesis draft, never published, she wrote, "The Claywell files show a pattern. Records vanish in the same months that reports of light reappear." Cho returned to the site once, photographing it at dawn. The image shows mist curling low to the ground and faintly what looks like the outline of a structure, though no building stood there for 60 years. The photograph now rests in the university's restricted collection. By 1988, locals began calling the area the Listening Field. Hunters swore that echoes behaved strangely there, gunshots muffled, footsteps doubled back faintly after each stride. A highway repairman who stopped nearby during a storm claimed to hear paper flapping, though the air was still. He followed the sound and found a scrap of cloth clinging to a fence post. It was blackened at the edges, and in its center, faint writing shimmered when struck by lightning. "If they forget me, I'll remember for them." By 1990, the Listening Field had become a local curiosity, marked only by a rusted sign and a gravel turnout. Travelers sometimes stopped to stretch their legs or take photographs, unaware of the stories buried beneath the grass. The ground was flat, featureless, yet those who stood there too long often reported a strange sensation, as if the air thickened around them, muting distant sounds. A small memorial plaque installed by a local historical club in 1989 read simply, "Claywell Township, 1873 to 1930, site of the Aldridge Homestead." Within months, the plaque had tarnished entirely black. That same year, a road maintenance worker discovered a small object half buried in the soil near the fence line. It was a brass latch, its hinge fused shut, engraved faintly with the initials M.W. The worker pocketed it, but returned the next day, unnerved by what he called a whispering noise, like a page being turned. He left the latch on the signpost and drove off, never to return. A few weeks later, the latch was gone. In the early 1990s, several amateur historians from Wichita attempted to reconstruct the widow's timeline using surviving documents. What they found was more absence than record. Files missing, signatures smudged, microfilms erased. Yet one article from 1924 remained intact. A single-column notice in the Claywell Gazette referencing the arrival of a woman from Missouri to inspect an estate. No further details followed. It was the first and last printed mention of Marion Whitlock during her lifetime. The historians concluded their paper with an uneasy statement. Perhaps she existed only in the space between record and recollection. By 1995, the land was sold to a private owner who fenced it off entirely. Those who passed by said that on certain nights the hollow still glowed faintly, not with fire but with something dimmer, steadier, like lamplight under glass. 5. Farmers from nearby counties claimed their radios crackled when tuned near that stretch of highway, sometimes forming what sounded like a woman's voice repeating fragments of words. Ledger, listen, name. Technicians found no source for the interference. In 1998, a final survey recorded the area as environmentally stable. The report, archived at the Kansas Department of Transportation, closes with a brief handwritten note in the margin. Different ink, unknown author, still here. Today the field lies undisturbed. Wild grass bends in the wind, erasing the last traces of the Aldridge Foundation. Yet locals say that when the dusk settles just right, the earth seems to shimmer faintly, as though the soil itself remembers. Those who stop to listen claim they can still hear it, a soft, deliberate scratching beneath the surface, the sound of ink drying on a page that never quite ends. And somewhere in Kansas, in a vault or a desk drawer, perhaps Ledger A waits, its cover closed, but its words still forming in the dark, quiet as breath.